There was a tremendous atmosphere of order, and at the same time of leisure. I mean, you weren't late for luncheon. The stairs, those lovely great staircases were cold enough. The wind didn't actually whistle, but the air, the whole atmosphere was cold. They had their own kinds of comfort. I mean, one always changed for dinner, but there was forever a roaring fire in the drawing room when you came down. And girls always came down, you know, sort of quite without coats and shawls and things. And somehow we didn't notice it.
My childhood was spent in County Galway, in the west of Ireland, in an old, romantic, and beautiful country house. It was here I learned my love for Ireland's architectural heritage. The Irish country house conjures up for us still, as it did for the poet William Butler Yeats, images, memories, and questions. I pace upon the battlements and stare on the foundations of a house, or where tree like a sooty finger starts from the earth, and send imagination forth under the day's declining beam, and call images and memories from ruin or from ancient trees, for I would ask a question of them all. Powerful images, powerful memories, that endure from century to century. For the ruined battlements and towers of Dromore Castle in County Limerick are not as old as they seem. They were built just over 100 years ago because Lord Limerick remembered the much more ancient castles that still cover the Irish landscape. It is in those ancient castles that the story of the Irish country house begins. Medieval Dunluce, crowning the precipitous cliffs on the Antrim coast, looks picturesque to us. But it was not built here just for the view. It was built for safety and security, so that the Lord and his family could sleep without fear of the unexpected enemy. If Dunluce, with its defended courtyards and flanking towers, was characteristically Irish, there is nothing insular about Roscommon Castle. More military fortress, perhaps, than house, it resembled the great Welsh castles of Edward I at Harlech and Beaumaris. Castle Roche, also of the 13th century, was probably more urbane. Life here, too, was dangerous. Its hilltop site is inhospitable. Its gate tower is defensive. But the remains of its great hall survive, its tall windows overlooking the County Louth landscape. The commonest type of Irish castle is the tower house, of which perhaps thousands survive, but often in ruins. This is Palace in County Galway, built for the Burkes in about 1500. The arrow loops that were needed lower down give way to pretty mullioned windows on the fourth floor, and there were good fireplaces in many of the rooms. Most of these tall, many-storied stone buildings were built in the 15th and 16th centuries, some for Irish families, some for the Anglo-Norman settlers. The bawn, or fortified enclosure, was built to protect stock in time of trouble. Not far from Palace is Derrahainy, dating from 1643. All set to withstand an attack, Derrahainy is one of the last of these tower houses to be built. Elsewhere by this date, greater comfort was being sought. Renaissance ideas of symmetry and classical detail were arriving in a country which the ancient Romans had never reached. Mount Long, in County Cork of 1631, is a castle, but with a classical flavor. More ample windows were opening, sometimes overlooking classical gardens. Portumna Castle of 1618, now being magnificently restored by the Office of Public Works, is one of the grandest classical Jacobean houses in the country. After the Battle of the Boyne of 1690, a new Irish political and social world began to take shape, and the great classical houses of the 18th century speak of different and more settled times. The Anglo-Irish landowners were confirmed in their estates, many won by confiscation, and a century of relative stability ensued. The 18th century, the great century of Irish Georgian architecture and craftsmanship, had begun. No one knows for certain when Beaulieu was built, but it was probably not long after the Battle of the Boyne, which was fought only a few miles from the house. But this is no castle. Here are no battlements, no protective bawn. William of Orange, the victor of the Boyne, rides triumphant among the family portraits. Superb wood carvings of martial trophies decorate the hall. But these warlike images and memories are not part of the world of real attack and defense. They belong now to the more relaxed and reflective world of portraiture, sculpture, and ornament. They are part of a family collection, built up continuously in this house over hundreds of years, which gives life and meaning to the architectural shell of bricks and mortar. Mount Ivors in County Clare has something of the same reflective quality as Beaulieu. Is there here a memory of those tall stone tower houses of earlier centuries? Perhaps. But arrow slit has yielded to classical window and battlement to classical frieze. This house was formed not from ideas of the turbulent Middle Ages, but from memories of ancient Rome and images of a classical tradition which, spreading over Europe, gradually softened and enriched the vocabulary of the Irish builders. And how were these images of Doric and Ionic and Corinthian, of pediment and column, transmitted to Ireland? The answer is largely through books and pictures. This is a page of the great architectural treatise published by the architect Palladio in Venice in 1570. Palladio's most popular formulas was that of the country house in the form of a central block, linked by arcades or colonnades to outlying wings. It suited Anglo-Irish gentlemen as well as it had suited the Venetian nobles for whom it was devised. Agricultural buildings, kitchens, or stables lay behind the side wings and colonnades, close to the residential central block, so that the entire composition was both practical and palatial. Florence Court in County Fermanagh is a highly sophisticated example of this arrangement. Florence Court is owned by the National Trust in Northern Ireland. Fully restored after a disastrous fire in 1955, the house is open to the public. Despite its size, it is a welcoming house. This is probably because its stonemasons and plaster workers were so obviously anxious to please. The details are not always learned. In fact, they can be a little crazy. But the craftsmen were enthusiastic and generous. And if the entrance hall is austere, you quickly pass into rooms of great Rococo exuberance. The ceiling of the dining room was nearly lost in the fire of 1955. It was saved by the drilling of holes through the plaster to let water from the firemen's hoses drain safely away. The greatest of these houses, and one of the great houses of Europe, is Castletown in County Kildare. It was started in 1722 for William Connolly, perhaps the wealthiest man in Ireland at that time. Son of an innkeeper from Donegal, he became Speaker of the Irish House of Commons. He made Castletown not just a triumphal assertion of his personal success, but, as his friend Bishop Berkeley put it, the epitome of Ireland. An assembly of the country's choicest buildings, stone and wood, filled with Irish furniture. The very silver that ornamented my locks and grates should be the produce of our minds. Connolly's house, in other words, was not just a building. It was conceived as a repository of Irish materials and craftsmanship. Admittedly, not all his craftsmen were Irish. He consulted an Italian architect, though we don't know how much of the Italian's advice he took. He certainly employed the Irish architect Edward Lovett Pearce. And Connolly's great-nephew, while allowing a Dublin craftsman called King to sign the staircase balustrade, employed the Swiss-Italian Lafranchini brothers for the plaster decoration of the staircase walls. The great showpiece of Castletown is the Long Gallery. Lady Caroline Dawson wrote of it in 1778. They tell me they live in it quite in the winter, for the servants can bring dinner or supper at one end without anyone hearing it at the other. At just this time, the gallery was decorated with figures from antiquity to become what is still one of the most splendid rooms in Ireland. In one of the country's earliest neoclassical interiors, the charming and sensual decorations are flanked by the busts of philosophers and poets. Castletown gave the lead in Palladian architecture in Ireland. Soon others followed. The Carton estate is next door to Castletown and was once the seat of the Dukes of Leinster. Rusborough in County Wicklow, the finest of the houses designed by Richard Castle, is superbly preserved and open to the public. Then, in the 1750s, one of the finest garden temples in Europe was erected. A garden temple that turned its back on Palladio and opened up new avenues of neoclassical design. This is Lord Charlemont's Casino at Marino, on the outskirts of Dublin, beautifully restored by the Irish government as a contribution to European Architectural Heritage Year in 1975. Designed by the architect William Chambers, it breathes the spirit of contemporary Paris and Rome, where Chambers had recently studied. It was to be an inspiration to Irish architects. Carved with minute delicacy, it is the most perfect building in Ireland. Or almost. Castle Cool, designed in the 1790s by James Wyatt for the Earl of Belmore, might be seen as a competitor. It is now owned by the National Trust in Northern Ireland. Here in County Fermanagh is one of the happiest moments in our story. A building of the highest quality, open to the public and surrounded by its intact parkland, a carefully contrived Arcadian landscape. Its palatial sequences of interiors are given life by the contents, which speak of continuous family residence in the house since the 18th century. Here is one of the great suites of furniture ordered by the second Earl early in the 19th century and specially made for Castle Cool by John Preston in Dublin. The relationship of buildings to landscape fascinated the builders of the period. Also in the north is another exquisite garden building, the Temple of the Winds at Mount Stewart, County Down. This little banqueting pavilion was inspired by an ancient Greek building, measured by the architect in Athens in the 1750s. The hunt always mattered to the Irish. It still does. This naive painting of about 1740 in Kilruddery, County Wicklow, makes another kind of statement about the relationship of the big house to its surroundings. The estate also imposed its own designs on nature with ornamental canals and a grand lime avenue. Kilrudery is still lived in by the Earls of Meath, who laid out the avenues and planted the trees. The formal garden is one of the very few to survive from the 17th century in Ireland. Its geometry holds some delightful surprises. The grandest composition of garden landscape in Ireland is at Powerscourt, also in County Wicklow. The house, built in 1731, suffered a disastrous fire in 1974, but the gardens are still world famous. Their terraces and pond were originally designed by Powerscourt's architect, Richard Castle, the great formal amphitheatre opening towards the distant hills. As the 18th century progressed, landscape gardeners abandoned the rulers and compasses needed to construct the geometrical gardens of Powerscourt or Kilrudery. They tried instead to rearrange nature to look even more like itself. There are formal terraces at Belvedere in County Westmeath, but beyond them there are more natural-looking, if equally contrived, surroundings. The designer of this park emigrated to the colonies and advertised his trade in the New York papers in the 1760s. At Westport House on Clew Bay in County Mayo, art and nature, geometry and studied informality combine with a little help from a mountain or two in one of the most striking settings for any Irish house. As the 19th century approached, architects had to be versatile. Some clients still wanted to live in classical temples, others wanted castles. Francis Johnston was happy to oblige with either. Here is his Townley Hall in County Louth of the 1790s, startlingly severe on the outside, but opening up to a breathtaking interior dominated by the most beautiful staircase in Ireland. At almost the same time, Johnston could go Gothic, as here at Charleville Forest in County Offaly. His ceiling may look as if it was designed in 15th century, until you scratch it and discover that instead of being medieval masonry, it's all a piece of light-hearted plaster fun. And the fun is spiced with a little bit of Gothic horror. His beautifully carved staircase would be at home in some of the Hollywood fantasies of our own era. Gothic became the rage for the 19th century. Often, battlements and turrets were added to existing plain Georgian boxes. This is Glynn in County Limerick, formerly Glynn House, and then suddenly, with battlements, Glynn Castle. The more picturesque and wild the setting, the greater the appeal of the romantic Gothic style. Pall Mall in Connemara was built in the 1860s for a wealthy Liverpool merchant. He and his family have gone. Happily, their castle survives and is now a convent school for girls. Not all houses were so lucky. At Thomastown in County Tipperary, where Father Theobald Matthew, the Apostle of Temperance, grew up, the 19th century turrets had a short life. The Great Famine of the 1840s brought ruin for many of the big landlords, as it did for the starving populace. The Land Acts at the turn of the century and those of the 1920s saw the lands of many of the great estates divided and sold to tenants, with serious consequences for the economy of the big house. In the political turmoil of the 1920s, many houses were burned. Roxburgh Castle, County Tyrone, burned 1922. Mitchelston Castle, County Cork, burned 1922. Desert Court, County Kilkenny, burned 1923. The list goes on. Castlebarrow in County Wexford, burned in 1923, is now one of the country's more spectacular ruins. Since then, accident has taken its toll. Rockingham, Powers Court, and more recently, the disastrous fire at Slane Castle. But the majority of ruined country houses were not the victims of political troubles or of accidents. They were either dismantled or were allowed to fall down from neglect. Hundreds of them, all over Ireland, have now vanished. The image of a ruling caste endured, but the memories of beauty, of the achievements of Irish craftsmen, were dimmed. Kinmure Park in County Dublin was demolished, making way for a housing estate. Its portico was left marooned above suburban Ireland. But the memory of beauty and the impulse to conserve and enjoy it have not been lost forever. The same public authority that all but demolished Kinmure Park has taken this building under its wing. Newbridge, County Dublin, home of the Cobb family since 1749. This authority also saved Malahide Castle, not far away, and opened it to the public. Perhaps the right answer has been found to one of Yeats's questions. How should the world be luckier if this house where passion and precision have been one, time out of mind, became ruinous? Of the thousands of big houses built on landed estates, only a small fraction survive in the hands of their original families. For many of these owners, changed times and circumstances demand new solutions to the heavy costs of upkeep. At Temple House in County Sligo, game birds once reserved for the guns of the Percivals and their friends now attract hunters from Europe and America as paying guests. The Percivals first built a home at Temple House in the 17th century. Today, Sandy Percival and his wife Deb bring a straightforward professionalism to the world of country house accommodation and dinner for 20 Frenchmen at the end of a day in the woods.
I'm a sheep farmer, basically, with 1,000 ewes, but I'm also a woodcock farmer, and I think it's a legitimate form of farming, the same as culling deer. I cull my woodcock. I've spent £2,500 making paths through the woods this year, especially for shooting. I have 1,000 acres, over 600 acres wood and scrubland, and a lot of people have been telling me over the last 30 years to plant it with spruce, but as you've seen today, I can make a good income by having guests to shoot, and we enjoy it. It's great fun. Until the 1940s, there were 11 girls and 5 men working in the house. 5 men, 7 boys in the garden, 5 girls in the dairies and with the hens, 23 men on the farm, 5 gamekeepers who were mostly involved in woodcock and snipe. They didn't rear many pheasants. Builders, carpenters, blacksmiths. So really, these estates were almost an industry in themselves. But the first time we came here was 1665. We've been here ever since, except for 3 years after the famine when we went bankrupt. Luckily, the third son had made a fortune out east, was able to buy the place back, and he brought back tenants from Ireland, Britain and America, and settled them back, re-roofed the houses, settled them back on the land, which has helped us ever since with the local population who remember that we did this. Deb and I planned to take guests, and it took us a couple of years to get it the sort of shape that we wanted it in. And then we started the shooting parties. We had to sell the wine the first year to help put some roof back on the house. Again this year we're going to have to do a huge job on the roof. You just think that you've got rid of the last bucket and you get another storm and you find another lot of leaks. I remember one IFA meeting of someone making rude remarks about me, my accent and being a gentleman farmer, and I just asked him to put up his hand, and when they saw my gnarled, hard-working hand compared to his smooth white one, everybody laughed and made my point.
The great land transfers of the early 20th century reduced most of the big estates to little more than the parkland within their walls. Among them was Clonallis in County Roscommon, ancestral home of the O'Connors of Connacht. Pierce O'Connor Nash, descendant of Irish high kings, today welcomes paying guests and tour parties.
The only way I can express the preservation of the Irish house is a phrase I used recently in a lecture I gave, which was that it was like breastfeeding a dinosaur in the 20th century. These houses don't deserve to live anymore. They shouldn't. If economics played a significant part in it, they wouldn't be in existence any longer. The land banks on which they were built originally have now totally disappeared. In most cases, the houses have no less than maybe 10%, or no more than 10% of their original land holdings. In the case of Clonallis, when this house was built, my great-grandfather had a land bank of around 12,000 acres, the income from which I would estimate to be equivalent to approximately £750,000 in present-day values. We have now about 5% of the land bank that he had. It's very hard to see in 20, 25 years' time maybe any of these houses surviving. Insofar as they will survive, I think they'll very much survive possibly in the leisure aspects of the houses such as this. 3 times more people visit historic houses than, for example, play golf or fish. That particular statistic never seems to be aired, but it nevertheless is an indicative of how important an asset they are to the tourism welfare of the state, and indeed of their cultural importance as well.
There is a growing recognition of the cultural and tourist potential of these houses, but Professor Kevin Nolan, chairman of the Castletown Foundation, points to another hazard which threatened the survival of the country house in this century in the Republic of Ireland.
In the 1960s, for example, I was denounced as a long-haired, left-wing intellectual lackey of belted earls by a certain Minister of State. I don't think my hair at that stage even would have come within the description of long-haired, or I wasn't particularly left-wing either, but that is the kind of thing was common at that time. Now, that atmosphere has very largely disappeared, though occasionally you will hear the voice. Occasionally, even to the present day, you will hear that sort of sound. But I think in official circles, in public circles generally, there is now a much fuller appreciation of the cultural significance of our inheritance from the 18th century.
It was fairly depressing. Every house in Ireland seemed to be for sale, and people were taking off the roof or blocking up the chimneys in order to save paying rates on the house, which meant that a lot of people just took the ultimate step and actually demolished the house. Or they'd call in a demolition contractor and he'd take the slates, maybe he'd pay a bit, you know, and you'd sell the doors and then you'd sell the mantelpieces, and then you'd just leave a ruin. And that happened a great deal in the 50s and 60s. I mean, that's what I think we fell down on. We didn't really regard them as objects of great beauty, except a very, very small group of people who were probably regarded as only half there, like myself.
The rescue of Castletown from the hands of the developers, carried through by Desmond Guinness from his own pocket in 1967, was a turning point in public awareness of Ireland's architectural heritage. The restoration of the house by the Irish Georgian Society set an example which couldn't be ignored.
In this great long gallery we're in here, this beautiful gallery, for many years it looked as though it was going to cease to be of any great significance. The plasterwork was falling off the walls, the paintings were being endangered, and a great piece of absolute restoration and conservation had to be done here.
With funds raised in Ireland, Britain, and America, the Irish Georgian Society and others have helped the Castletown Foundation to restore much of the interior. Happily, the painters, gilders, carvers, plasterworkers, cabinet makers, sculptors, masons, who labored with miraculous delicacy and precision to make Castletown the epitome of Ireland, did not labor in vain. The walls of this room have been recovered with silk damask, specially woven in France. In Northern Ireland, the National Trust has saved many houses like Castletown. In the Republic, on the other hand, pressure falls on government and on bodies like the Irish Georgian Society. Fortunately, the government has now accepted responsibility for Castletown, one of its many recent initiatives in this field. Meanwhile, the Irish Georgian Society continues its work.
Well, we work in all sorts of different ways. If we think a building is important enough, we may, like in the case of Taylor's Hall, take a lease of it for 99 years at no rent, supposing someone's going to give it to us, and then restore it from the ground up. And we did that with the Damer House, and we're doing it now with Doneraile Court. Or we might just simply give a grant. Supposing you had an important house and you couldn't afford to mend the pediment or the chimneys or the roof or something like that, we might give you a direct grant. Or we might do the work for you.
This is a Ledwardstown house. It was built by the Ledward family. It's supposed to be to the design of Richard Castle. It was built in 1746. And the story goes that the Feeneys were tenants of the original Ledward family who owned it, and that they were evicted in or about 1838. And in 1911, my grandfather, Lawrence Feeney also, he came back from Buenos Aires and bought the property at that time. And I came into the property then some 8-9 years ago. It's described by Maurice Craig as probably the nicest small Georgian house in Ireland. It was in a very bad condition when I came to live here, but since then we've done a lot of work with it, and a lot of that work has been helped greatly by the Irish Georgian Society and more recently by the American Ireland Fund, who helped us to replace the floors. Now, it's a constant battle, and but it's a labour of love, and we put a lot of work into it over the years, but
eventually we would hope that it would be something well worth restoring and that people would appreciate it, and anybody who comes to see it is quite welcome to do so. We would hope that it will be used as a family home over the next period of years, and that it's probably a little bit small to be used as anything other than a family home.
Conservation is a slow job, even when the state pays the workers, as it is doing here at Doneraile Court in County Cork, a major project of the Irish Georgian Society. This elegant 18th century house, designed by Isaac Rothery for the first Viscount Doneraile, was abandoned for 7 years and became almost derelict. Despite the state's help, the restoration has made heavy calls on Irish Georgian Society funds. As well as agreeing to take over Castletown, the Irish government has acknowledged the claims of private owners of historic houses with its recently introduced taxation relief. In an equally significant initiative, it established the National Heritage Council, with responsibility for many heritage matters, including architecture. All of this is of fundamental importance in the task of saving part of the architectural heritage of Ireland, and indeed of Europe. Different interpretations of Ireland's past sharpen the debate between various approaches to the conservation of the Irish country house. At Strokestown Park in County Roscommon, curator Luke Dodd interprets the estate in terms of the local community which centered on it. His perspective on the social hierarchies common in all great houses of the period is an uncompromising one, and adds a touch of theater to stories he tells visitors.
A room like this, the galleried kitchen, is a perfect architectural example of the segregation that was maintained in the fabric of the building itself between the two sets of people who lived in the house. Obviously the staff who worked at ground level in the kitchen preparing all the food, and then the gallery here at first level for the family and their visitors to the house to observe what was going on in the kitchen, and also used by the lady of the house every Monday morning to drop her menu down to the cook, listing all the meals for the week. The house controlled a huge section of land and controlled thousands of people's destiny for, nearly 300 years. And that reputation, which is largely bad because of subsequent developments, in more recent times in Ireland, is what Strokestown Park now has to be made about, rather than making it just about the family who occupy the house. Really, it has to be made about the tens of thousands of people's lives who are really not acknowledged in the house at any point, but who actually made the whole thing possible and kept it going for so long. The obvious way in which that's been done at the moment is the conversion of the original 4 stable yards into a museum for the Irish famine of the 1840s. Strokestown Park had a very particular history at the time. Major Mahon, the landlord, was shot dead in 1847 at the height of the famine. Houses like this were built for very specific reasons, and in an Ireland which is radically different to the one in which we now live. And I think places like this have to take that on board somehow, and that does not mean converting them into hotels and luxury places for another elite that will just replace the one who used to live in them, but to try and reintegrate them back into Irish history.
Many fine houses have indeed been sold for hotels and country clubs, with serious consequences for their ancient parklands.
A great house, on the other hand, a great house, can only be properly understood in its own proper surroundings. The parkland, look out the window here, even what remains of the parkland will show how significant it is to keep the environment intact. Now, my worry about golf courses in particular is that they destroy parklands.
We do feel that a house like that is not, isn't right unless you have the parkland as well and all the trees. I feel so sad that so many families have beggared themselves to try and keep places together, finally gone under, and then the person that buys it takes the roof off the house, cuts down all the trees, ploughs up all the land, and you've got part of the Irish national heritage destroyed in a few months. I think that if the lands pass from one generation to another, I think there could be mitigation of inheritance taxes. But if it's sold great money outside, well then whop it on. But the only way to keep these places alive, I think, is to keep the original families in it.
Clonallis is the only Irish historic house, as opposed to Anglo-Irish or Norman Irish house in Ireland. So the contents very much reflect that. But we're also extremely conscious of the fact that here was to be found in microcosm the history of Ireland. If one dispersed the contents of this house, they were never going to be replaced again. There simply is no other parallel to this house to be found in the world.
When a great country house is sold, its collections of family possessions may be scattered across the globe and robbed of their collective meaning. At his home beside the Shannon, the Knight of Glyn has worked hard to conserve in his house the special wholeness and context of things that belong together.
My ancestor's servant is bringing him to challenge the duel in Spain, and the servant cried in Irish from the crowd, "Stick him where they stick the pigs, knight." And my ancestor killed him and found that he had chainmail on underneath his clothes. So he was rather a hero and was painted when he came back to England on his way back to Glyn. If one moves on here, this is Nestor, a very fine academic portrait of the 1880s, being brought to court to Queen Victoria for presentation.
When my ancestor, Colonel John, the volunteer in the hall, built the house, he really went bankrupt, like many of these old families did. They were a rather pretentious lot, and they wanted to cut a very fine figure in the county, and this house to this day is incomplete on the top floor. So when he died in 1803, there was a sheriff's sale here, and most of the furniture was sold then. I wanted to create a kind of museum in this house of Irish craftsmanship. So in those days I was working at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it was possible to buy Irish furniture and Irish things relatively cheaply then, because they weren't valued. They certainly weren't valued in Ireland. So pictures, furniture, memorabilia, all this sort of thing, I've tried to bring back here so as to make this a kind of example of what was made in Ireland, and which through the sad history of the landlord class in Ireland in the 19th and the 20th century has meant that it was totally dispersed. The importance of a house is its whole philosophical background, its grounds, its stabling, its pictures, the things associated with the family in it. I'm not suggesting that there should be a vast number of these kept, but say even if 10 or 12 were in some way safeguarded, I think would deal with the matter with a geographic spread around Ireland, not all of them just around Dublin, where there are so many already. So I do think that the families that live in these houses are probably the best guardians of them. They're certainly, as government has realized only too clearly, the cheapest way of looking after a house.
This all sounds merely like the defense of ancient privilege, but the real message is deeper. That these houses, their parklands, buildings and contents matter to us all. The National Heritage Council acknowledged this in the help they gave to Bantry House, a great tourist attraction in West Cork. Bantry House was actually the first of the Republic's stately homes to open its doors to the public, almost 50 years ago. Here it is used for rehearsal of the town's brass and reed band, and there, at the trombone, is Bantry's owner, Egerton Shelswell White. His family, originally Earls of Bantry, have lived in this house since 1739. The New Deal between the great houses and modern Ireland is still being developed and refined. But the owners, caught up in earning a living and struggling to support the splendor around them, now feel a little more optimistic.
The attitude of the people of Ireland, I think, is changing a great deal. They realize that the tourists, the sophisticated or even the package tourists, wants to see these places in a rather rainy country. They appreciate them being opened, and I think their minds are now changing over the old oppression situation built by the wicked landlords, things like that. And they come here and ooh and ah about the beauty of the craftsmanship, mostly done by Irish craftsmen. So they have just as much a part of Ireland's heritage as anything else.
The state is now committed to the ideal of conservation, but resources are scarce in Ireland, and there are many other priorities. In times of economic strain, events can move swiftly as houses and their historic collections come under threat. Rescue operations will still need the urgency and determination and the funding of voluntary groups like the Irish Georgian Society. Ruins may be evocative and even beautiful, but Ireland doesn't need any more of them.